Hey there, friends. It's Jen Petal with By the Shore Stamping in for another Teach Me Tuesday episode. Today I want to show you how to do this stepped up kind of elegant card that I made with quite a bit of gold impact. So there's a couple of things I want to show you with this in addition to stamping on or embossing on vellum. We're also adhering the vellum too, which can be sometimes tricky. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm starting with Fresh Fig, and I stole the inspiration from this card right out of the Stampin' Up! Annual catalog. I unfortunately didn't look at the page before I jumped on the video, but it's the page that features the Petal Garden suite. So this is the paper that's associated with that. But there's also the stamp set, which is the stamp set I'm using. I actually I had just assembled this one because I hadn't even pulled it out and I've had it for quite a while. So I'm using that stamp set, a little bit of that paper, the Garden Trellis embossing folder, which is also part of that suite. So I'm pulling from that collection, wherever that is in the catalog. So here is that embossed sheet. It's kind of fun. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just laying that on top of the card base. And you can see it's color on color, and there's a reason why I do that. It's because I don't like to actually emboss right on my card front, because then it shows through on this side when you open the card, and that's just not my favorite thing personally. So I like to emboss on a separate piece and then layer it on top of the card. And I do use a little bit more adhesive when I adhere that to the card. Because of the texture on the cardstock, it will sometimes have a tendency to want to pull away from the cardstock. So I do add a little bit of extra adhesive just to help that out a little bit. All right, so now let's go ahead and do our embossing. So I'm starting with a little piece. It's 3 by 4.5 of our vellum cardstock. So it's a bit thicker, but it's not quite as thick as our regular cardstock, but it is definitely thicker than just regular vellum. So I'm going to take the big flower image, and I'm using my Versamark. So I'm going to take my Versamark pad, and I'm going to go ahead and ink up that image. And anytime the stamp is actually bigger than the ink pad, I find it easier to bring the ink pad to the stamp rather than the stamp to the ink pad. So I inked that up, and I'm going to stamp it on this vellum cardstock. And another little tip, I cut my cardstock to the same size as the wood block. So that's how I got the sizing for this, and that means as long as I put it straight on my block, I can actually center this wood block on that embossing sheet, and I should get it centered. So that's a little trick, and one of the reasons why I like to use wood mount stamps is because I can just measure the block and then know what size cardstock I need. Now I'm taking the gold embossing powder, and I'm just going to sprinkle that all over that flower image. And I'm being very liberal here with the embossing powder because it doesn't really matter because we're going to reuse all of that. So I'm going to tap off the excess, and I can actually even sort of flip it off here. Get anything that's excess or erroneous off the page. Just being careful not to actually touch that flower image because that will rub off the embossing powder. You can see I actually have a little bit, or I don't know if you can see in the camera, but I can see I have a little bit of glitter mixed in with my embossing powder, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but that's not how it's intended to be. I'm going to go ahead and pour this embossing powder right back into my container, and then I'm just going to shake out that grid sheet so that I don't get embossing powder everywhere. All right, cover that embossing powder as well so we don't end up with any accidents. So now I have my vellum with the powder. Now, if you're using the Stampin' Up! Embossing gun, which is a great embossing gun, you'll see there are two, can you see that? There it is. You can see there's 2 speeds. So I'm going to use number 1, which is the lower speed, because that's going to make sure I don't burn my vellum. So you're just going to go ahead, and it does take a little bit longer with this lower setting to actually get the powder to melt. I'm just going to do it here for a second to see if I can get it. There it goes. So see how that's changing right there in the middle? You can see that changing over. So that's what you want to do for the whole piece. That's going to melt that embossing powder, and you'll see you'll get that nice shiny effect here versus that muted look. So it will reflect the light, and so it's very easy to tell once it's fully embossed. I'm going to set that aside though, just for time's sake, and I've already got one pre-done here. And I wanted to actually have some of that pretty paper to show behind my embossed flower. Okay, so I'm going to use the Tombow liquid adhesive. This is actually great for using for vellum. You do need to make sure I can get, is this the right one? You do want to make sure that when you put it on, you don't leave it in its white state. And what I mean by that is you really want to make sure when you rub it on, you're actually rubbing in that, whoops, that's a lot. You're rubbing that white in so that it doesn't actually show on the cardstock. Because what happens is if you leave it in that really dark white state, when you adhere it, it will show through on the other side. See that? So I just make sure I rub it in really, really well. That's a little bit excess there. So, and you want to make sure you get it all along the edge, but just using a little bit instead of that big blob that I got initially. So I'm just going to kind of go all the way around the edges and make sure I'm rubbing this in nicely so that you can get it fully rubbed in. And then I usually start, whoops, I stuck it right down to my paper here. I usually start at one end. Oops, that's still kind of, and I've got a little bit of a border on this, so I'm going to start like this. You do have to kind of move somewhat quickly, and then I just kind of rub my way up, making sure that you kind of get rid of any of those bubbles as you go. There you go. And then you're ready to go. So there is my attached piece. Okay, now before I attach that to the gold, or actually, yeah, before I attach the gold, I'm gonna grab the Calypso Coral sheer ribbon. That's also part of this suite. And I'm gonna take some and leave some hanging off this edge so that it comes over where I want to tie. I'm tying on the the right hand side, so I need to make sure there's enough hanging over here so I can make it to this right side. And then I want to wrap it twice. So I'm gonna wrap once, trying to keep it straight, and then I'm gonna wrap again and leave enough for me to have some extra to tie. So then I'm going to take my ribbon, and I always do, I think it's called, is it a French knot? I forget now. It just totally slipped my brain. There is a name for it, and I can't think of it right now, but I'm making a little X, making left over right, so my left side is over my right side, making a little X right there. Then I'm going to tuck this under, and I'm making sure the underside of this ribbon is facing up, and I'm going to twist this one so the underside is facing up there. Now you could tie a knot right there, but I find with regular ribbon, it makes it kind of go wonky. If you're using baker's twine, you can tie the knot first and hold it in place for you while you tie the bow, but I find the ribbon sometimes will end up being tied sideways if you tie the knot first. So I'm going to go ahead and go right into my little bow. There we go. So I just did a little loop and then wrapped it around and then pulled this nice and tight. And I'm just going to fluff those little bows a little bit, put my fingers in there and fluff them out, and then just kind of fiddle with them a little bit. And then I'm going to trim off the excess. Now I can go ahead and tape this to the gold layer. I just did 2/8 of an inch beyond the measurement of the pattern paper because I just wanted a little tiny bit of that gold to show from underneath. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tape this down to the golds. Whoops. Just a little tiny bit showing. Make sure that's completely flat. Okay, looking good so far. Now I can attach it to the front of the card, and I did use dimensionals for that. So I'm going to pull a couple of my dimensionals, flip this over. I always put one in each corner, and then one or two in the middle. We'll go with one today, since that's all of the regular ones I have at the moment. I'll cut up the edges of those dimensionals to use on a future project, but for now, we'll just do that. So I'm going to put that down on top, like that, so you can see our little fancy schmancy card is coming together. I then used the Very Vanilla cardstock. I had originally done Whisper White, but when you put it up against the card, it just looked so stark against it. So that was why I went with the vanilla. You can see it's a little bit softer, a little more elegant, like the card itself. And I'm taking the Fresh Fig ink and the I Adore You sentiment from that stamp set, the Graceful Garden stamp set. Whoops, I was not paying attention and I got too much ink on there. Let's try that again. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and stamp that, and I'm using the 1.5 inch punch, and I'm going to flip that over so I can see where I'm going, and I'm going to punch that sentiment out. And because we're going with the elegant look, I did want to give a little bit of aging to this, so I took my soft suede ink, which is a dark brown, and just a little corner of my stamping sponge, and I'm just going to go ahead and drag that around the edge of that sentiment. So you get kind of a little bit of an aged look. Now, I'm going to take this little piece of gold glimmer paper, and I'm just going to take my scissors, and I'm going to cut in the middle, and then I'm going to go corner to center, and corner to center, to get a nice little tail on that. And I'm going to go ahead, whoops, sorry, I do that at least once every time. I'm going to go ahead and attach that just above the ribbon and let it hang off just to the point where it's almost off the card, but not quite. I'm going to put that down. And then I'm going to use dimensionals again for the back of this. I'm just going to cut up some of these little strips. I'm actually running low on dimensionals, so, oops, and I need to put that on my list. So I need to get some more of those because that makes me nervous not having enough dimensionals in the area. I'm going to take these off. And now I can stick that I Adore You right over the ribbon. It's a little higher, actually, than I probably want. It's kind of covering the rose a little bit. See if I can get this off. Yep. Move it down just a slight bit so we can get that in a better position. There we go. Okay, and then just to add one more little gold element, I took my gold enamel dots from the Metallics collection, and I'm going to steal one of those little hearts. Since we're saying I adore you, I think a heart is appropriate. And I'm going to stick that right there. And then you have your finished card. So just a little bit of a stepped up, kind of fancied up card for a really special friend. And a little bit of tips for you on how to adhere the vellum and how to emboss on the vellum cardstock. So I hope you enjoyed that card, and thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe to my channel, the little red button below, and I will see you again next week for the next installment of Teach Me Tuesday. Have a great week. Thanks for watching.